So you've got all these school policies, but we know within those policies, there's a lot of marginalization that is happening for LGBTQ individuals. So how can we help schools in the DC area where our youth spend most of their day be able to create affirming environments?
And we're seeing this in states that are passing bans on medical care for trans youth, even though this care is, agreed upon by all major medical associations as medically necessary.
We are ground zero in a sense for how this is going to work across the country. And we have also had to fight the hardest we've ever had to in order to prevent the bills from going forward.
When you consider the ways in which varying forms of marginalization can intersect with a person's sexual orientation or gender identity, those problems become manifest in multitudes.
Good evening and welcome. This evening, Class Act HR 73 is honored to present LGBTQ Youth Rights, Protecting the Queer Frontier. I'm Marion Dry, she, her, hers, co-chair of Class Act HR 73. This evening's forum is presented in support and in collaboration with Class Act's partner, Justice Aid. Justice Aid is an organization that uses music and the arts to raise money to support powerful tipping point organizations fighting injustice and inequality. And they give dollar for dollar of every contribution they raise to their grantee partners. This year, that partner is SMILE, supporting and mentoring youth advocates and leaders. Based in the Washington, D.C. metro area, SMILE supports and empowers lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer youth ages 6 to 24. Class Act is honored to present this forum exploring the issues these young people face and the work that our panelists are doing throughout the United States to protect, uplift, and support these cherished members of our society and make our country one where there is justice and a good life for all. I am now pleased to introduce our extraordinary activist panelists and moderator. First of all, Lee Nolan Soul is a senior staff attorney at the ACLU LGBTQ and HIV project. Before joining that endeavor, Lee was a staff attorney with the ACLU of Washington, D.C. for several years. Previously, she clerked for the Honorable Gladys Kessler of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia and was an associate with Paul Hastings LLP in Washington, D.C. Jorge Membreño is SMILE's Deputy Executive Director. Coming to SMILE as a licensed independent clinical social worker, Jorge previously served as the Director of Youth Housing and Director of Clinical Services. Prior to joining the team, Jorge worked as a social worker and clinical supervisor in school and mental health agency settings. Finally, Alana Yochum is Executive Director of Equality Ohio and an attorney. She also serves as the board chair for the Equality Federation, a national organization focused on capacity building and support for statewide LGBTQ+ organizations across the country. She was previously an associate at Squire Patton Boggs LLP in Cleveland. Finally, our moderator, Taz Jones, is an associate at Latham and Watkins LLP in Washington, D.C., and a member of the board of Justice Aid. Taz, I'd like to hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marion. And thank you all for joining us. Most of all, thank you to our wonderful panelists for making time to share your stories, your work experience, and your lived experience. The confluence of all of those things I know is going to create for all of us a really special conversation. So thank you. As Marion just mentioned, my name is Taz Jones. I'm an attorney practicing in DC. I'm also a board member at Justice Aid. And last but certainly not least, I'm very proudly a member of the LGBTQ community. So it is an honor to get to facilitate this conversation tonight. And before we get to hear from our experts, the folks that you're all really here to listen to, thought I'd kick things off at least with two framing considerations, thoughts that I hope you'll keep in mind and take to heart throughout our discussion. The first of which has to do with how we approach the conversation, how we engage with it. And the second having to do with the filter, the lens through which we view these discussions and experiences. So first, with approaching the conversation, I hope that you'll consider yourselves more than just audience members. I hope that you'll think of yourselves as students. I certainly think of myself as a student in this conversation as well. And that tees up the second framing consideration that I hope that you'll keep in mind, which has to do with the lens through which we're engaging with the substance of this conversation. For example, even though that I proudly identify and represent the LGBTQ community every day of my life, as a cisgendered white male, there's also lots of experiences reflected and represented by the LGBTQ community that my lived experience has not borne out. And that speaks to an important point about this lens-like consideration, which is the privilege that each of us, in some way or another, intrinsically through our lived experience, carries with us into our perspectives and imbued within the conversations that we engage with. My privilege means that I am a student here because the experiences that are being shared will touch upon perspectives and experiences that I personally haven't had myself, even though there are other ways in which my life will overlap with the substance we'll engage with tonight. And that's important to think about because queer people are not a monolith. We contain multitudes, and the ways in which those multitudes play out through lived experience tells a diverse and vibrant and wonderful story. But the nature of marginalization likewise means that there is a dark side to that coin, the opposite side, the one that queer people have confronted, acknowledged, and chosen to catalyze into meaningful change. And that change is why we're here tonight. And the panelists that we have on our discussion tonight are those change makers. So thank you again for joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Jorge Membrana from Smile. Jorge, thank you so much for joining us. I've had the privilege of getting to know Smile through my work with Justice Aid. I suspect that some of our audience members might as well be familiar, but for those that aren't, I would love if you could tell us a little bit about when Smile got its start and why. Were there any factors or events that gave rise to Smile's founding?
Thank you so much for that question. And thank you everybody for being here tonight. So a big theme throughout most of this has been community response as we've been preparing for this. And really in Taz's opening remarks it's always about community response. And so Smile actually was formed based on that. If you think back to the 80s when Smile formed back in 1984, youth were being hospitalized, not just hospitalized, institutionalized in mental health hospitals because of their identities. The city just had no idea what to do. The psychology was just far behind where it needed to be, and the resources were not as available as they needed to be. And so Smile rose out of that and said, what can we be doing in response to make sure our LGBTQ youth are supported, they're affirmed, and they have opportunity to grow into the adults that they want to grow into. And so Smile grew out of that and became, first and foremost, just a place for people to be able to hang out with each other in a safe and affirming environment and explore their identities in a way that's like without shame, without limits, and just say, here is who I am, and I see that in you, and we acknowledge that, and we respect that, and we love that about each other.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Jorge. Relatedly, because Smile is doing so much for so many people in the region where I live, in the Washington region, I wonder if you could speak to how, if so, Smile's operations have expanded or evolved, and likewise, what gave rise to that evolution?
Again, based on community response, if thinking back to the 80s up to now, a lot of the issues that existed then are still existing now, unfortunately. So the first place where we started to work was in that just community building space, but then we went into the advocacy and activism realm. And so that meant that while we were running drop-in center programs, we were also working within schools with gender and sexuality alliances, which GSAs within schools, but then also working with community-based organizations, working with government organizations, foundations, corporations, in that we're trying to work ourselves out of a job. Like we're trying to teach other organizations to create affirming spaces so that Smile isn't the only place that a youth can go and feel like they are going to be valued and affirmed, that they can go anywhere and feel like their identity is not going to be criminalized like we are unfortunately seeing currently. So in that, we started that activism and then also just teaching within those other components. From there, we expanded into the housing realm. As I'm sure most of you know, the statistic of within DC and the nation, the number is the same. Of all the youth experiencing homelessness, 40% identify as part of the LGBT community. 40%. That's an unfathomable number. And so we went into the housing realm specifically to try to alleviate that on a few fronts. One, make sure kids were housed, but the second was that make sure that the activism and the advocacy that we were working at was trying to prevent that in the future. So trying to tackle it on two fronts. And we expanded from one house to now we just opened up our fifth program. So we have 4 housing programs and 1 rapid rehousing program where youth are actually get to sign their own lease in their own apartments, where they have that financial freedom, that sustainability of life that we had been striving for since the very beginning of like trying to carve out a future that our youth wanted. And that's a huge component of what we do, is make sure that it's the future that our youth want, not necessarily like all of the adults in society and the oppressive systems that have been designed to oppress folks have designed for them, but one that they have created for them. From that, we also expanded into clinical services, which was, again, directly in response to seeing the trauma that our youth were experiencing. We created a clinical service department to create free and affirming mental health care. If you think throughout the entirety of COVID, if you are somebody who has looked for a therapist, incredibly tough because there are long waiting lists, there are few and far between, but then if you add an affirming therapist on top of that, someone who is actually skilled in working with the LGBT community, we are even fewer and far between. So we are able to try to remove some of those barriers to create that access. And one other component that I'll add to it is that with our youth programming having been where it was to where it is now, part of that growth was around that activism. So we were able to start that Rise Up camp, or an activist camp that we have every summer. And that means youth from across the nation are able to get on Zoom just like this for a few days and learn from other activists across the nation. Think, what does activism mean for you, and what does it mean for you in your community, and how you can make that change? Also, along with that, one tiny little nugget that I will add is we have a Little Smiles program, which is probably our absolute cutest program, which is for 6 to 12-year-olds. And it's a space for youth, again, to be able to say, here is who I am. I would love to be affirmed. And like, we're like, yeah, absolutely. Now let's paint a picture and like explore that identity. And so we're able to create that space for 6 to 12-year-olds, because as we have seen across the country, youth are coming out younger and younger and exploring their gender identity younger and younger. And so we're able to create a space for them and the adults in their lives to feel affirmed, but more than anything else, to start building the world and their trajectory forward.
Incredible. Thank you so much for that. Just fantastic overview. It's a perfect example and representation of why Justice 8 is so thrilled to partner with Smile this year. Jorge, although you concluded with a really wonderfully uplifting point, you also touched on something that I think segs nicely to our next panelist that I'd like to speak with, because you mentioned that for queer young people, their mere existence is being criminalized in real time. As we speak right now, there are people out and about in this nation that are seeking to criminalize the mere existence of living and breathing as a queer young person. And Alana from Equality Ohio, who I'm so thankful to have with us tonight, is fighting against that exact undercurrent. So Alana, I wondered if you could join us first in the conversation by explaining how Equality Ohio got its start. Were there any specific events giving rise to its founding or other factors? Because I'm sure our audience would love to hear about it.
Absolutely, Taz. It is such an honor to be here among these esteemed panelists. Truly grateful for your attendance as the audience members too. Equality Ohio is the statewide LGBTQ education and advocacy organization. I like to say that we change hearts, laws, and minds. And we are an organization that is fighting on the front lines of policy. And if you just turn on the news today, you know that we have a lot of work ahead of us. And there's an organization that is like ours in almost every state across the country. I'll talk about that a little bit later on in this. But to answer your question, Taz, Equality Ohio, we were formed 16 years ago, and we came out of one of these very battles. It was when Ohioans sadly enshrined into our very constitution discrimination by defining marriage as between one man and one woman. We were caught flat-footed. 65 advocates came together in a church basement, and we essentially said, never again. I was baby advocate at the time. I wasn't in that room, but I was coming up into this and said, my gosh, I'm so happy that Inequality Ohio is coming into existence. And so glad that full circle here I am now being able to lead the organization. And even though we were born out of that marriage inequality, we've actually had many different areas fighting because we don't have basic equality in so many fundamental areas of our lives. Ohio is one of 29 states still lacking basic non-discrimination protections in employment, housing, and public accommodations, for example. So that's our founding, but now we have been able to expand our work both offensively of trying to improve policies, and then still sadly defensively. There's a whole lot of work that needs to be done in real time.
Yeah, you got your hands full, which is unfortunate to say the very least by virtue of the work that you're doing, but I am thankful on behalf of a lot of folks for the fact of you doing that work. Speaking of the work, would love to hear a little bit more, whether it's an example or a broader story about how it is exactly that Equality Ohio is going forth and fighting for queer folks and especially queer youth in the state.
Absolutely. We are working at the State House, and we work to essentially meet our legislators on a journey where they are to help them understand that they all have LGBTQ constituents and that they have to listen to them, that our lives matter, and that we need protections under the law equally with any other constituency. I'll give one quick anecdote of where it's been very positive. You'll remember back a few years ago when they were trying to regulate bathroom use and say that you could only use restrooms based on your birth certificate. That law passed in North Carolina and really raised an outcry. There was a legislator here in Ohio who wanted to do the very same thing, but we are a nonpartisan organization. We believe in relationship. And we got him to sit down with ourselves and his transgender constituents from across the state. And he met those constituents, he heard their stories, and he even corrected his pronoun use throughout the meeting. It was one of the most powerful meetings I have ever been part of. And it was supposed to be an hour-long meeting, but 2 hours later, we were still there and still talking. And at the end of it, he turned to us and he said, my God, I had no idea that I was more your ally than not. He shut down the bill. He shut down the anti-transgender rhetoric on his Facebook page, and the bill never came to Ohio. Most of what we do, Taz, is actually what you never hear about in the news. It's stories like that. But sadly, we're in a moment of this again right now when we're seeing across the country these waves of bills that are directly politicizing our LGBTQ youth. And so that is the fight that we are enduring right now. One other aspect of our work that I want to talk about is something that grew from this policy work, but it's because we were getting so many questions about what are my rights under the law. And so in 2019, I'm proud to say that we opened one of the very first legal clinics in the country for LGBTQ people. We serve LGBTQ people at 300% of the federal poverty line for free in key areas of laws because our laws were just not designed for queer families and they need extra support in navigating them. So I really encourage you to pass the word on about that. It's 855 LGBT law if you need to access our clinic, or you can go to our website to access that program through the intake form on our website. So policy, changing hearts, minds, and laws, and then seeking redress under the laws, but not in the same way as our amazing colleague at the ACLU. When we identify impact litigation, we are so grateful to have you as a partner and give those cases to you.
Thank you so much, Alana. Yeah, the tagline you've mentioned to me contains a sort of a subtitle, which is fostering and channeling empathy. The story you shared is a great example of how close in kind we all are, even in moments when we may not realize it. And it's by making those pathways, forging those pathways to empathy that we help people recognize as much. So it's wonderful to hear all of that. And on the note that you concluded with, to our wonderful colleague at the ACLU, Lee, I would love to turn things over to you next. Again, and same as I've said before, thank you so much for joining us. So I'm sure that most of our audience has probably heard of the ACLU in general, but I suspect that at least some of them may not be familiar with the specific project with which you're affiliated in the work that you're doing. And so same as I've asked with other panelists, I wondered if you might share a little bit of information about how your work got started and what sort of forces gave rise to its founding.
Yeah, thanks, Taz, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm Lee Melansol. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU's LGBTQ plus and HIV project. It's a little bit of a mouthful. And like Taz said, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the ACLU. We're a fairly large impact litigation organization, among other things, right? I think we're most well known for our litigation, but we try to do a lot of other work, including education and policy work and things like that. And, the courts are kind of an area of last resort. So we're so grateful for all of the work that's done outside of the courts. The ACLU's been around for over 100 years now, and I think they brought the first LGBT rights case back in the 30s. So they've been doing this work for a really long time. The project itself came about, I believe, in 1986. And Stonewall had already happened, but that's when you start seeing a lot of the litigation around LGBT issues, right? So like Bowers v. Hardwick, the AIDS epidemic, and all of the things that went with that. And so that's when the project was founded. Our work has really changed and evolved over the years, right? From around criminalization of sodomy, and then we saw kind of all of the marriage litigation. And now a lot of what we're seeing has to do with trans youth specifically, and just trans rights generally. Alana mentioned kind of the bathroom bill. Unfortunately, Alabama just passed one of those today, and we had been hopeful that they wouldn't. And Alabama actually passed 3 bills today, so or 3 issues, right? So they criminalized medical care for trans youth as a felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about this later as well, but they passed the bathroom bill, and they passed as a surprise amendment, another piece that is equivalent to Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. So so now at this point, the ACLU's LGBT work is, I'd say, about 3/4 on trans issues. And then that's as a direct result of these kind of recent attacks on trans folks in this country.
Thank you for sharing that, Lee. And as I'll probably have to repeat myself again, it's unfortunate in some respects to have to hear this. But at the same time, it's so important to hear it for the exact fact that it's unfortunate. And I just don't know what we would do without the work that you folks are doing. So we're already sort of on to the next question that I wanted to ask you about, which is great. My next question was going to be, how exactly does your work define and decide its focus? And we're already building to that. It sounds to me like the work you're doing is necessarily somewhat reactive. It sounds like you're monitoring for what's happening on the ground in state houses, especially to see which marginalized communities, especially from within the LGBTQ family, are being most subjugated and targeted, and then moving forward with the plan of action from there. Does that sound right? And if so, is there anything you would add to that characterization?
Yeah, I say mostly right. And that's, for a long time, it was more proactive on our part, right? So trying to push and expand the laws to recognize LGBTQ people's humanity and our civil rights. And that's shifted a little bit in the last few years as we've seen state houses really go on the attack on trans folks, but particularly trans youth, right? And I think they use the justification of, well, we're protecting the children in a way that they can't really for the adults. And so that's part of why we're seeing this focus really on kids, and also to erase trans youth, right? They don't want trans adults, so they're focusing on trans kids. So a lot of it is reactive. There, I think, have been over 200 anti-trans bills in state houses this year. And so fortunately, not all of them have passed, but that is well beyond our capacity, despite being a very large organization. And so it's a balance of, okay, well, how can we stem the tide at impact litigation? So what's going to set good precedent? What's going to really help people? Sometimes it's just, is the law too egregious to not say something? And do we have to stand up and do something? So this Alabama law on the criminalization of medical care, like we've already announced that we're going to sue on that. And part of that is because it's so bad, but also to show other states that you will be sued if you do this, because it's clearly unconstitutional. And there's consensus in the medical community that this is the appropriate treatment. And it's also, like I said, so egregious, right? It's criminalizing. You're punishing doctors by up to 10 years in prison. And you think about what else in the medical system do we do that with? Really nothing. And so we're stretched right now for sure. And so are playing a little bit more defense than we would like, but it's so important to show up on those cases.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And again, thank you for showing up. If our audience hasn't yet noticed a thematic umbrella so far in this conversation, I'll just say the point outright. Together, collectively, through the panel that we've organized tonight, we have Jorge, who represents on-the-ground grassroots social services, direct impact assistance to the folks who are harmed by a lot of the things that we're talking about tonight. At the same time, we have Alana, who is working in state houses while these laws are being drafted in real time to the best of our abilities, prevent the active and real-time marginalization of queer young people. And unfortunately, when those laws nevertheless do get on the books, we have people like Lee at ACLU to take over from there and to fight them at the jurisprudential level. So we have a 360-degree perspective on this panel right now on what's happening and how we should approach the problem in order to fix it. And with that in mind, I want to keep this conversation moving forward. We've gotten to know our panelists, we've gotten to know who they're with and what it is they do. And so now I want to talk about the present and the urgency of it all. I personally felt overwhelmed at times hearing the details of real-time developments actively aimed at children and young people, designed to criminalize their existence, deny their basic humanity, and frankly, to ensure that they grow up in a nation that does not guarantee them equal protection under the laws. So urgency is a key theme for this conversation. And with that in mind, Alana, I'd love to turn to you next. Lee just mentioned a bill that passed in Alabama just today, and I believe that unfortunately may have been the case in Ohio as well. Would you care to share a little bit about what you're seeing on the ground right now in Ohio?
Absolutely. So happy to share. And Lee, beautiful setup and explanation of some of these bills. And I was so devastated to see Alabama pass those today. I'm going to zoom out a little bit first and do a little scan of what we are seeing across the country, because it will also help tell the story of what's on the ground right now in real time in Ohio. As Lee said, we've seen more than 200 bills introduced across the country that are anti-LGBTQ bills. Sadly, that's not uncommon for the last 5 years or so. Each year we've seen approximately that amount. What is uncommon for me, having worked in this for more than a decade now, is that this year they are passing. We have so often been able to defeat them at the state level. And this year they have been gaining momentum and actually passing their legislatures. So first I want to step back and say, why are we hearing so many of these bills happening right now? Like what is it at this particular moment? And that's because many states have very short and aggressive legislative sessions between January and about May. Many states only have it for that period of the year, and then they go away for the rest of the year. I'm from one of a handful of states that we are in session all the time for 2 years at a period, which is a marathon, not a sprint for us here in Ohio. But that's why we're hearing about so many of these bills being introduced, and then sadly, so many of them actually passing at this time. And so I want to share a little bit about what is the landscape, what are the types of bills that we're seeing. We've heard, Lee, you shared a little bit about one type, but I would say there's about 3 main types of queer specific bills that we are seeing. The first, as Lee was talking about, are gender affirming care bans, which seek to, and one of these is pending in Ohio as well, they seek to prohibit affirming care to young people mentally and physically. And they have severe ramifications from criminalization to delicensure, which is the criminal penalty, or which is the penalty in Ohio's bill, to fines, decoupling of funding to institutions that provide affirming care. These types of bill are trying to stop the privacy of a patient, a young transgender person, and their family care with their doctor in its tracks. We've seen many of these bills introduced across the country, and at least 3 to date that have actually passed. And it's very scary. The other situation I want to just note is Texas, which they're not in legislative session right now, but they're a special situation. Their governor actually tried to overtly start prosecuting families providing gender affirming care to their children as child abuse. I want to say this very clearly. This has absolutely no basis in the law. It is illegal. It is a manufactured hook to try to prosecute these families, and it is pure politicalization of the most vulnerable youth in Texas. That has already been enjoined by ACLU, and I'm guessing a couple other wonderful groups who have sued there, so thank you for that. So the gender affirming care bans are one group of legislation. The other that we're seeing are sport bans. And these are trying to prohibit our young people just from playing sports. They're trying to say that transgender young people somehow have an unfair advantage by playing on the team matching their gender identity. And we know that the statistics simply do not bear this out. Kids just want to play for all the reasons that all of us growing up wanted to play soccer or basketball or football. And it's really trying to, again, politicize our youth. And it's a solution in search of a problem. Our state athletic associations have regulated this and have regulated this, frankly, for nearly a decade in my state, longer in other places. And, this applies to a small percentage of the population as well. And yet our legislatures are spending a lot of time on this issue. Again, it's a politicization of the young folks in our states. This bill has shown up. Over 31 have been introduced across the country. And to date, as of today, I can count 10 states that have passed. We have this bill in Ohio. They tried to ram it through. We were able to thwart them thanks to, frankly, the Ohio State University helping to come out and say, we will not stand for this in our state. But it is still actively pending and could go through the end of the session. And the third type of bill I want to talk about is very much in the news right now. If you've opened the news, you see Ohio there because it is the Don't Say Gay, Don't Mention Race types of bills or censorship and curriculum bans. Sadly, on Monday, I came home from a wonderful vacation to see that they were introducing this bill, a somewhat copycat of Florida's in our state, but more terrible. It was coupled with an anti-honesty in education bill that is really seeking to censure or outright ban the authentic teaching of racism, slavery, our history of the Holocaust, and other historical events here in Ohio. So these types of bills are, again, they're limiting our speech to our young people through curriculum bans. The reason we call it a Don't Say Gay bill, you'll hear sometimes criticism, well, gay isn't in this bill. No, that's because you're trying to censure the discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity or expression. Mind you, each of us has a sexual orientation and gender identity or expression, no matter where on the spectrum we fall. But you're really trying to say only LGBTQ families cannot be discussed in our classrooms through books, through talking about your lived experience in your identity, or even through talking about relevant news issues, of which this is a part. That is just trying to tamp down speech and erase our family's existence in our schools. So those are the three main types of bills we're seeing across the country, Taz. All three of those exist in Ohio, and I'm proud to say, at least as of today, they have not passed, and we are committed to ensuring that they won't, thanks to the activism of wonderful folks like folks who are here on this call today.
Absolutely. And wonderful folks like you, Alana. You just took my question and made it 20 times better. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. It was just tremendously informative. And to see the passion that you feel for this cause on behalf of so many vulnerable people is something that I know resonates with our entire audience. You also teed up a lot of important details that seg nicely to a few questions I'd love to turn now to Lee for, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Thank you again, Alana. So Lee, Alana has been speaking to us right now about just patently, facially discriminatory laws taking hold or attempting to take hold in real time. On your end, you're dealing with jurisprudence, and very often, especially in the realm of civil rights, those sorts of court cases arise out of the types of discriminatory laws that we just heard about from Alana. Thankfully, the modern era of sorts has included several highlights for humankind in general, and especially queer people. This June, Pride Month, will mark 7 years, I think it is, since Obergefell, when the Supreme Court recognized an equal right to marriage. And it'll mark 2 years since Bostock, when the Supreme Court recognized that Title VII for employment rights and protections applies to all people, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation. I think for a lot of people, including those who are within our community, but nevertheless carry great privilege with them, it might feel as though living in this post-Obergefell, post-Bostock world, that it is now a safe and comfortable place to be in America as a queer person. And I wonder if you agree with that characterization, and if so, or if not, why that is.
Well, it'll probably come as no surprise to you that I don't agree with that characterization. First of all, I want to just say, queer people come of, they're in every race, every socioeconomic status, like all of the genders. And so there's so many other types of oppression that queer people are facing, right? And so just like we have those levels of equality, but there's so much intersectionality for the LGBTQ community that prevents, them from fully realizing their civil rights. But beyond that, even just for the LGBTQ community generally, there's still a lot outstanding. I think Alana mentioned earlier that, there's a lot of states that still don't have protections for housing and for, now there is some in employment, but in so many other realms of our life and public accommodations and things like that. So that's still really an outstanding problem, right? And if you show up to rent an apartment and you're a woman and you show up with your wife and they deny you the apartment because you're gay, like, do you actually fully have the right to marry because it's causing discrimination in other ways? So there's still so much that we're seeing, and we're still seeing a lot of efforts to carve back those rights, to roll them back. Tennessee introduced a bill this session, creating a new one man, one woman marriage to try to kind of create an alternative. And that's, a clear attack on marriage equality. And, we've seen some court decisions trying to distinguish Bostock and really not apply that line of reasoning elsewhere. For those that aren't familiar, I think Taji mentioned this, but Bostock is the one that said that Title VII's prohibitions on sex discrimination apply to discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity as well. And so we're seeing states say that doesn't apply under their state laws or in other arenas. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And, we're seeing a lot of efforts to carve out religious carve-outs on these bills, right? So the Supreme Court's going to be hearing another case. It's called 303 Commons. And a lot of these come up with weddings, right? So what's the limit on these anti-discrimination laws on wedding services providers? So we've talked about cakes, but now we're talking about videographers and photographers and websites and things like that. So I think that's a big area that we're going to see is kind of a license to discriminate based on religion. That's really concerning. So yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done. And then also, all those laws that Alana mentioned, right? That it's about limiting people's access to be themselves, but also to information in the schools and the books, and really isolating people, LGBTQ youth. And I'd say that the advent of the internet has done wonderful things for the LGBTQ community because it helps people know that they're not alone. But these are efforts to, again, silence and isolate people. And I'm sure Jorge sees a lot of that as well. And so we really need to lift up our youth and also our entire community and let them know that there are paths forward, that they're not alone, and that there's ways to thrive and be LGBTQ. And that's so important because, as Jorge mentioned, right, 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. So we still have a long ways to go.
Thank you so much, Lee. Much like Alana, much like everything that's been said so far, just so well stated and so informative. I appreciate it tremendously. Now that we've learned a great bit about the urgency that's playing out in state houses and in courtrooms across the country, Jorge, I'd love to speak with you next. first, and to that point, urgency. It's a theme of the last few minutes of this discussion. In your experience and in your work directly with queer young people, do you feel that urgency as well? And if so, or if not, I wonder if you could elaborate.
Yeah, I would say the urgency never really goes away, unfortunately. I'd say we kind of triage based on what's happening. And most of it is like, is it a political season? All right, when and where are kids going to come under attack? And it's wild to think that a system that's designed for us to elect officials to represent us become the thing that we have to worry about because it's the thing that's going to attack our kids. Like, that is nonsense to me. Like, thinking back on hearing about the laws in these other states, we would be out of a job at Smile. They would, absolutely prosecute us in a hurry. I would lose my therapy license because we wouldn't stop working. Ethically, we are going to do exactly what we need to do for our youth because that is our charge to do. And so the urgency never goes away. If we think about even the housing realm that Lee just mentioned, we can tackle that on a few fronts and we can do our absolute best to house youth. But at the same time, we're fighting against systems that are increasing rent, that they are making housing just unattainable for a lot of folks. And so being able to fight that on multiple fronts and being able to carve out a future when our youth have been oppressed for so long is incredibly hard to do. And now that states are criminalizing them from the moment that they are in, like, as children, to say, all right, in the next 20 years, I'm anticipating that you can be successful when the entirety of your identity has been oppressed is nonsense. And so for a lot of the work that we do, we get to our youth for a Little Smiles program when they're very, very young, which is great. And so, like, thinking about the community response side of this is, like, we started that program because teachers, social workers, doctors, parents, adults, like all these folks and people in these kids' lives were calling us and saying, we wish there was a service for youth because they are either getting bullied at school, they have questions about sexual orientation, gender identity. And this is in, like, the DMV, the DC area, which is sometimes feels like a progressive bubble. But if, like, we were seeing that there, and that's just youth to youth interaction, I can't imagine the extent of the fear and the trauma that youth are going to be experiencing if you've got that youth to youth interaction. And then you've also got the state that is saying who you are is not okay and who you are is criminal. And I think based on just seeing how many of these laws are spreading so quickly, it's safe to say that there are no borders for hate, right? Like, Florida happened and we all knew this is a domino effect for elections, but it's also a domino effect of, like, if you give evil a megaphone, people who want to hear it are going to hear it and it's going to spread. And now we're seeing the exact same thing happen where it transcends borders. And so our youth are constantly being affected. And the other tough part is that because it's so broadcast for us to be aware of, for us to be able to really fight it, it's also reaching our youth's ears in that they can see, okay, this was in Florida and in Texas, in Alabama, in Tennessee, in Ohio. And so, like, our youth have that inherent sense of fear when they've already experienced trauma and now they're seeing it nationally. And so part of the work that we will continue to do is meet that urgency and meet them with the services that are very much needed and just continue to support our youth as much as we possibly can.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jorge. There's two things I want to touch on before we keep trucking. I've got another question for you. The first one, though, has to do with if we could all visualize, so to speak, a map of the country and how there could be a starting point and then a ripple that flows from it. Even while we're talking about young people, I hope that we'll all keep in mind how important it is not to infantilize them in the metaphorical or metaphysical sense. These are smart kids. They know what's going on in the world, and especially by virtue of being actively marginalized, they're particularly smart. They know what these dog whistles are intended to mean. They know what these policies will impart for their livelihoods. And to be at such a young age and by extension in a vulnerable position and to see this playing out is such a tragedy. The other thing that you mentioned, and that I think is just baked into everything you said about Smiles operations, is this. I would guess that you folks are planning all the time. planning how you can expand your operations, planning how you can improve upon them, and planning how you can reach out to even more folks in the community to lift them up and to make sure that they are seen and heard and made to feel safe. So with this theme of urgency that surrounds our most recent portion of the conversation, is there anything that Smile is doing relative to it in terms of its planning operations for the future?
Yeah, we're always trying to assess how we can be more present in more places. To give you an example, a few years ago, I went down to Charlotte to work with an organization there around housing because we knew that the infrastructure might not be there and the funding might not be there in the same way that it might be in DC. And so it was just one way in which we were able to take a model that we saw in DC and take it to a southern state and helping them be able to grow. But at the same time, looking at even our like Little Smiles program or Rise Up, which works specifically with elementary, middle school, and high school age youth, thinking about how can we be supporting them best. And that means like thinking through what are the laws in each state and how does that affect any realm of us going national with any program. And like if we wanted to expand Little Smiles to say, okay, we want to be able to open this everywhere or make a national platform everywhere, like where are the safeguards that we have to put in place? Like we can create those in DC and know that it'll be supported. But if we wanted to, support a bunch of families in Florida or Texas, like what's going to happen to those families who want to support their kids and have like signed on to something that's going to affirm them and support them. So definitely, yes, always thinking about it. But second would be always thinking about it mindfully of like, there's nothing that's going to stop us from doing what we need to do, but it will take the entirety of community support, which could mean a lot of lawyers. So heads up for everybody.
Thank you so much, Jorge. And with those thoughts in mind, I want to keep us trucking forward. I mean, we've learned so much about the work that your organizations are doing and that you as individuals are facilitating, spearheading. We've learned about the urgency of this moment in particular, which is astounding given the longevity of the gay liberation movement, of queer rights in general. This is not a new topic, and yet in 2022, it's an urgent moment. But it's urgent for reasons that are obviously about more than just the timeliness of all of this. It's an urgent consideration because we are talking about human lives being actively diminished and erased and dehumanized on the basis of their immutable existence and characteristics, how they see themselves, how they exhibit their humanity, who they love, and so on. And that's what I want to turn to next. I'll preview to the audience that some of this is going to be sad, but it's also going to be really important to hear about. And if you don't mind, Jorge, I want to turn back to you first. And I welcome you to take this question however you'd like it. Personally, I'm actually interested in pivoting a little bit to something uplifting for at least a change of pace for a moment here. You get to work with young people, which is awesome. Young people are the spirit of our country in many respects, and they're certainly the future of it for obvious reasons. And I'm willing to bet that imbues for you a great deal of inspiration and encouragement. And I wondered if you could share with the audience any examples of stories of inspiration and encouragement that you draw from this opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for positioning this like in the beauty of this all, the beauty of the work that we do. One story is one of our very first youth in our youth housing programs. Very, very like tough background in that trans woman was coming from an African country fleeing because of persecution, and her family was constantly under violent threat. Came to the US, was bouncing around city to city until she could find a place to land. She finally got connected to us and moved into our housing program. And when you move into our housing program, you immediately get a gift card to buy groceries and gift cards for transportation, just like the things that start setting you up. And she had started to work at the time. And she goes out to the store after she moves in, and she comes back maybe 2 hours later, goes up to her room, and then comes back later on and is chatting with myself and the case manager about, what was going on in her life. And she told us this like beautiful story where it was the first time in a very long time where she could exist as a complete individual. And so the 2 hours that she was gone, she actually went on a shopping spree came back, and she said she went upstairs and tried on all of the clothes and looked in the mirror, and it was the first time that she was like, this is a space where I get to just do this. Like, I get to dress based on me. And she came downstairs and told us about it, and we celebrated with her about it. And it was like, then she went back up to her room, and like those quiet moments, those tiny like 5-minute conversations where like the work that we're doing isn't about accolades. It's not about like larger awards, anything like that. It's about those moments where a youth can feel like I get to exist in my own skin and be celebrated for who I am. And like, it just keeps us going, and it like fills our cup every day.
Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that story. I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only person in this conversation for whom that story is the highlight of their day. And you get to live out those highlights repeatedly throughout your day. And we're just grateful to get to learn from your perspective. With that in mind, I'd love to turn to Alana next. Alana, the nature of your work, like everyone else in this conversation, is about people. It's about their livelihoods. It's about their stories. It's about their humanity, and it's about their representation, especially. Are you interfacing yourself with families and with young people in Ohio? And if so, much as with Jorge, I would welcome you to take this question however you'd like, but I would love to learn more about what you're seeing through those interactions right now.
Yeah, absolutely. We are interfacing with our families every day and our young folks specifically, because these bills are so aimed at trying to erase our LGBTQ youth, but specifically our transgender youth. Just this week, my team, they brought parents and transgender youth to meet with one of the sponsors of the healthcare ban. And it was a very productive meeting, as productive as one of these can be. We try to create a safe space both for our families to ensure their safety, but also for the legislator to have a significant opportunity for growth. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes that's not. These meetings, some are better than others. The way I want to look at this question is to do a little bit of statistics and a little bit of the tough stuff, actually. You know, there's about 500,000 LGBTQ Ohioans in our state, and about 30% of them are raising families. And so these bills particularly harm those 30% of queer folks who are raising children and have families in our state. I'm going to repeat the statistic that Jorge said, because it is just unfathomable. Of all of our LGBTQ homeless youth, 40% of them identify as LGBTQ. I mean, that is just really unconscionable, because it also shows the lack of support at home. Trevor Project has said that 1 in 3 LGBTQ young people find their home to be affirming as all, only 1 in 3. And 42% of LGBTQ youth seriously contemplated suicide in the last year. We have learned when these bills are moving, when we hear about them in the news, one of the first things that I do when a bill like this drops is I text the Trevor Project and I say, make your front lines aware, Ohio has this coming. Because if you were to lay the graph on the introductions of these bills across the country with the spikes in calls to the suicide helpline, they would match each other. And so even in the places where these are being introduced and not passed, we are hoping to hold the line here in Ohio. We are giving it everything we've got. It does not mean that damage is not happening. And so I just want to say that to folks who might say, wow, 31 bills, or, you know, this is just a phase. This is, we're going to beat them in the end. All of that may be true. We will have many victories ultimately in these legislatures, but it doesn't mean that the harm is not being done simply by the introduction of themselves, simply by young people seeing themselves be questioned by the elected leaders who are supposed to be providing solutions and protecting them. So that's sadly our experience with LGBTQ youth, but I'm going to end on a positive note that resilience is the key element that I see in all of our families.
the resilience of parents who will do anything for their children and who will tell these stories so passionately and supportively, the resilience of young folks like the 12-year-old young trans woman who was in this meeting this week, who so passionately has been advocating since she was 7 years old in Ohio and stopped one of the bills in its tracks because of her advocacy. That's the hope that I have in this generation, but we can't also know that these bills pose real harm to them.
Thank you, Alon. That was, it's an understatement to say that that was wonderfully stated, but it was certainly wonderfully stated and much more. And your point about resiliency rings true, I think, for every queer person. For every queer person living now, before, or in the future, they will know what it means to be resilient. And the history of queer liberation bears that out, right? I mean, the Stonewall riots, it's easy to forget, Pride rather, started as a riot. And queer people decided to take an opportunity that was forced upon them, namely their subjugation, and to first and foremost fight it and say, absolutely not, we will be resilient. And then second, to prove their resiliency by turning that into a party, into a celebration, into parades and community, into an opportunity to come together in plain view and the daylight and the sunlight of the day, and to say, yeah, we're not going anywhere because we've always been here and we always will. And so thank you for what you're doing on that front. Lee, I'd love to turn to you next with a somewhat similar but slightly different question. So as an attorney, you're well steeped in how precedent works and how the life of a lawyer works, basically. I mean, to be a lawyer, to challenge something as discriminatory is inherently, to some extent, reactive, right? To challenge the unconstitutionality of a law, that law needs to have been passed, or to challenge the treatment of a specific group of people, likewise. Just for example, when the Supreme Court decided Loving versus Virginia back in the day to say that anti-miscegenation laws prohibiting couples of different races from marrying, to declare that unconstitutional, the Lovings had to have been discriminated against in the first place. And you're in this tough position, it seems to me, where you have to watch as these horrible things play out before you can change them. And I wonder if you could speak to how you're seeing that premise play out today. I mean, I asked Alana, for example, about how she's interfacing with young people in Ohio, and Jorge, how that shows in his work. What about through yours? How does it show up in the work the ACLU is doing?
Yeah, thanks, Taz. So it is reactive, right? And we have to move quickly a lot of times because, this bill that, for example, the bill that passed in Alabama, they labeled it as an emergency. So it has an effective date 30 days after the governor signs it. And so what that's meant for us as a litigation team is that we can't wait till the bill's even passed to start working on it, right? We've been working on this lawsuit for months. And, we hoped that all that work would be for naught and that the bill wouldn't pass, but we have to be ready to go and to file within a few days. So it also means, because there's so many bills, we're doing a lot of work to set up lawsuits that we may never have to file. So there's just a lot of extra work that's happening. But these bills are really time sensitive. For example, the one in Alabama, again, that criminalizes this medical care, that has huge ramifications for the youth if it were to go into effect, right? And litigation is a long process. It is not the best tool, and it can take years. And so what treatment looks like for trans youth, for the most part, is pre-puberty. It's what we call kind of social transition, that there's no medical intervention. It's, about kind of getting to wear the clothes that they want, that they can wear their hair like they want, use the pronouns and the name that they want. So nothing medical. Once the youth hits puberty, that's when the doctors get involved. And all of this is decided with, the parents and with a physician and with mental health support. It is a long process and a very involved one. And none of these decisions are made lightly. But at that point, the youth is usually put on what's called puberty blockers. And so that prevents puberty from kind of continuing, to give the child more time to figure out what they want. It is reversible. It's used in cisgender kids that hit puberty too early. And you'll see that a lot of these bills don't ban those uses, right? So it's not that the medication is so dangerous. It's only banned for trans kids. They're still using it for cisgender kids in other situations. And then it's later, so around like kind of 14, 15, 16, that then again, in consultation with the parents, the physician, mental health therapist, that the decision can be made to do hormone therapy. And so if you are a transgender girl, that is somebody who was assigned male at birth but identifies as female, you might start estrogen therapy and go through a more feminine puberty. So this law bans that. And so if you stop a child from their puberty blockers, that means they're going to start pretty immediately what we call endogenous puberty, the puberty of the gender that they don't identify with, that has permanent impacts on them and their ability to transition later if that's what they want. So we need to move so quickly to try to enjoin that, to stop it, because time is of the essence, right? This litigation is not going to move quickly enough to protect those kids, and that they'll suffer these really, irreversible to some degree harms. And I just wanted to also point out that this medical care is often performed on intersex infants without their consent. So to the extent that, the governments are talking about protecting the children, they all include exceptions to affirm a gender of somebody that is like intersex, or what they view as cisgender, so that these surgeries are being performed on youth in certain circumstances, and it's really just trans youth that are being banned from these. But I also wanted to highlight that none of these decisions are made easily or quickly or without careful thought, and so these laws go against what the youth want, what their families want, and what their physicians recommend for them. And that's highly problematic.
Indeed. And thank you, Lee. I realize that there's one frame of question that I did pose to Jorge and Alana, and that I haven't posed to you. And I would love to welcome for you the same opportunity, which has to do with drawing inspiration from this work. As an attorney myself, we are constantly in the weeds of the facts and the details, the black letter law. And while I personally find it to be very exciting and engaging, it's not what a lot of people would probably say, like, oh, that's exciting or fun. We're nerds about this stuff. But there's a lot of encouragement and inspiration baked into that nerd stuff. And I wonder if you have any stories of inspiration to share, be it about your clients, your cases, the outcomes, your own lived experience. I welcome you to take this however you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, Taz. I do. I mean, I think for me, it really comes back to the clients, right? And seeing them live their life and stand up for what they believe in and try to make the world a better place for their community, right? Like, it is a huge step as an LGBTQ youth to get involved in a lawsuit and to put yourself and your family out there like that, right? I mean, I'm involved in the case as a lawyer, but the vulnerability is not anywhere near the same as what it is for a client. And so I'm so inspired by the people who choose to be our plaintiffs and to kind of take a stand. And then also reading about their journeys and, hearing what their treatment has meant to them and how it's changed their lives. And particularly reading about the parents, right? And a lot of the parents that we work with, they're not necessarily activists. They weren't activists until their kids came along. And it's so clear to them that this is the right thing to do for their kids, to affirm them in their gender and to kind of see how much they appreciate how their child blossoms after they're able to live in their gender identity is really beautiful. And yeah, it makes it all the more difficult to fathom how the state thinks it can know better and take that away from these kids.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Lee, for sharing that. We are getting to a good point, I think, to start fielding some questions from our wonderful audience. So the audience member who posed this question asked as follows, Alana, and I would love to hear your thoughts. It's a very thoughtful question. They asked, what's the best way to argue for trans athletes' participation in the sports of their choice from a scientific perspective, because it seems that many people who are speaking out against trans kids, trans youth who just want to play sports, think that there's this innate scientific basis to make their view well-reasoned, notwithstanding, of course, the humanity of the young person caught in the middle. I wonder, from your perspective and through your experience lobbying on similar or perhaps this exact issue, what you would say in response.
Absolutely. This is a question that we often hear our legislators ask or their constituents raise as a concern. And I think it comes from this idea of misunderstanding what it means to be transgender, what it means to transition, and that there is a long-standing process that is part of this. These bills are designed to ban transgender people from playing on the sport matching their gender identity outright. What is in existence in all of our sport areas actually are regulatory bodies that have flexibility and that turn to the science in order to inform how to create a fair playing field. So for example, in Ohio, the Ohio High School Athletic Association has had a process in place for more than a decade. It requires a period of transition. It requires documentation and certain affirmations from medical providers to ensure that different hormone levels are at a space where they have deemed is safe and fair for playing. Now, if you have a law that is outright banning this, not only is that shutting down the conversation and harming our transgender youth outright and denying their existence and ability to play, it's also denying the science behind this. And so, in fact, having regulatory bodies is a much better place for this conversation to be taking place because the science is evolving here. So I think that that is something that may not be known. It may not be understood that there are regulations in place even up at the Olympic levels. For more than a decade, the Olympic has had regulations and policies in place for athletes to follow. Could those policies be improved? Absolutely, they are not perfect. But again, it's an evolving conversation and it is rooted in science. And these laws just seek to outright ignore it and ignore the existence of our transgender athletes and ignore their ability and desire to play sports.
And I'll just add to that too. I mean, that was fantastic, Alana. Some of these laws, if the concern, to the extent that the concern is about transgender girls having some sort of advantage, some of these laws ban all trans kids from playing, right? And so any sort of even supposed scientific justification is belied by the outright ban. And it also harms cisgender kids, right? Like I've known cisgender girls who've, played on the football team or played on the wrestling team. And some of these laws ban that as well. So like, I think the science, isn't there for these bans, but also the bans aren't even tied to the science in a narrow way.
Thank you so much, Lee. And thank you to our audience as more and more questions start to enter the fold. I want to turn to one next that veers slightly outside of the scope of our precise conversation, i.e. queer young people, but it does focus precisely on the scope of this group that's assembled today, which is Class Act. One of our audience members asked, I think, a very thoughtful question, and I'm going to take the lead at least at first, but I welcome our panelists to speak up as well. And the question was this: it says, members of our class grew to adulthood in an era that was actively hostile to LGBT individuals. And the question states, I rarely hear any acknowledgement of the presence of LGBT people in the class of 73. What would you suggest about how to make our class more welcoming and inclusive of LGBT classmates? I, of course, cannot speak for all queer people because we're not a monolith, but I can at least draw from my own personal experience and my own personal paranoia when I was not yet feeling empowered and encouraged enough to come out and speak truth to power on who I am as a person, which informs my answer as follows. For one thing, I would encourage you all to be proactive and thoughtful and as empathetic as you possibly can be around these topics, because for any individual who is up against a countercurrent pushing more powerfully against them than they singularly can push back, telling them, don't speak up, don't be yourself, and don't speak truth to power about what's just intrinsically true to your existence, that's a horrible feeling. And it encourages us as queer people to stay quiet. And when people stay quiet about their core fundamentality, good things typically do not follow. So I would encourage you to speak out on behalf of queer people, but on a basis that is informed by queer people. Because when you do that, you effectively amplify queer experiences and you amplify queer voices rather than speaking for queer voices. And when you amplify queer voices, you in turn create an environment that has the feeling of containing queer voices and being space for queer voices, having space for queer voices. And that has the potential and indeed the power to transform an environment in which an individual might otherwise feel oppressed into one in which they feel empowered. So I would suggest first listening and taking notes, whether literally or figuratively, to inform your understanding. That in turn will allow you to create pathways to empathy. And once you've created those pathways, you'll relate on a level that enables you to speak up in a capacity that empowers your queer friends and colleagues.
I think that answer, Taz, also extends to you, the youth in your life, right? The youth in your life see you doing that and speaking on these issues in a positive way. You're also signaling to them that you are a safe space should they need one in the future. And, you know, and I like think back on my childhood, and I can remember very specific moments, you know, of seeing LGBTQ representation or people speaking up in favor of LGBTQ rights. And like, even though I didn't know I was part of that community at the time, it's still stuck in my head. And so by the time I was coming out, I kind of knew some more of the safe spaces. So you never know who's listening and who's going to be impacted by that allyship. You know, and a simple one is like, even in your Zoom profile, like, you know, we all have our pronouns in ours. As someone who does present as somewhat gender nonconforming, right? It is helpful to me when I see somebody has their pronouns in their name, that they've been thoughtful about that. And that's somebody who's thoughtful on this issue, and that's a safer space to me. So like, that's such a minor thing, but like it does signal in that way. So you just never know who's listening.
Absolutely. And it very often, at least in my experience, I'm willing to bet y'all can relate. The minor things can also be major things. I remember all of the instances in my youth in which someone said something to me that made me feel less than. And I'm willing to bet that they don't remember saying it, or at least that many of them don't remember saying it. And that's what a microaggression is in many respects. It's the notion that for those who carry privilege with them, their actions are effectively ineffectual. But for those who are marginalized, those actions are not ineffectual by any means. They are compounding. And eventually they bear a weight that is too much for any one person. So I agree completely with your input, Lee, and I appreciate it. We have another great question lined up. This time I want to put Jorge in the hot seat, if that's all right, Jorge. But not for long, because then we're going to turn to Alana. I'm willing to bet she has some experience there as well. But this is an interesting question that, from a nonprofit's perspective, you know, constantly working on fundraising, I would imagine you might have some thoughts. The question is as follows. An individual asked, do you think that corporate pledges of support to resist these anti-LGBTQ bills makes any difference to the struggle at the state level? I'll maybe save some of the state level struggle stuff for Alana, unless you'd like to speak to it. But I know that Smile does a lot of fundraising. I know that Smile engages with large companies in so doing. And I know that all of us see how corporations are multifaceted, for better or worse, to be diplomatic about it. So what are your thoughts on how that's playing out and the extent to which it's helpful?
That's a great question. We were literally having this discussion the other day in a development meeting. There is no perfect corporation. There is nobody who I can look at and be like, you have 100% seal of inclusivity. Because we know that they can donate to great causes on one branch, but the next branch might be donating to causes that are oppressive. And so it's such like a dance that we have to do, in that, like, all right, do we take the money and move the work forward to actively fight against them later? Do we fight against them now? And so what we try to do is have a lot of meetings up front. There is no one that we will partner with where we haven't had extensive meetings and research to figure out exactly who at least the branch that we're dealing with is, and whether it's like a local DC office or whether it's like a larger corporation. but really trying to gauge, like, what are your intentions here? If their intention is to move at the forefront for an issue that we know that they have oppressed in the past, absolutely not. But if we know that they are trying to make strides forward and like we have taken the time to chat that through with them, it's a different conversation. And so it's, it's a balance. It's a balance for everything that we do and the fundraising that we do. Like, we obviously need the funds to do the work, but most of the times we don't need the ball and chain with it.
Thanks, Jorge. And Alana, I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, it is slightly different. I'm in a state that is very conservative. I'm in a state that has a lot of businesses in it, and I'm actually going to even show you my profile picture. It's Ohio Business Competes, which is the business coalition that is formed in Ohio specifically to support LGBTQ individuals in the state through advancing the work for non-discrimination protections and being able to speak up in moments exactly like now when we're seeing these attacks on the community. So in our state, it is actually the business voices that are so important in these moments. It is the business voice that came out earlier this week. Our Ohio chamber tweeted proactively against the Don't Say Gay, Don't Mention Race bill that has been introduced in our state. I can't tell you how much that triggered in terms of amplifying additional voices and giving somewhat permission for folks who wanted to speak out but maybe had some hesitancy in doing so. So I am 100% with you, Jorge. Our businesses, our corporate community is imperfect at best. And when they want to speak out in support of their LGBTQ employees, their families who are living in Ohio and have a patchwork of protections and literally lose their civil rights on their commute in the morning, we are very grateful and appreciative that more and more voices are coming to the table. That Ohio Business Competes Coalition, we started about 6 years ago with 10 companies, and we're up to 1,200 companies now that are using their voice. It's no cost. This is not a financial situation, but it's using their voice to advance LGBTQ equality in our state. And I have found it makes a huge difference in a conservative state like ours.
Thank you, Alana. That's incredibly insightful to hear as well. To the audience, I asked and you answered. We're getting tons of really phenomenal questions right now. And to be frank, and unfortunately, more questions than I think we're going to probably have time to cover. And indeed, the powers that be tell me that we're at about a minute left. But with that minute, I don't want to waste. Lee, I've got a question for you that comes from an attorney. So I think you're best suited to field this one. And this person asked, they said, I'm an attorney in the DC and Virginia area. How can I get more involved and where can I find training on effective advocacy? Particularly because this and other individuals would want to, of course, avoid taking on a case that inadvertently could, frame an issue in a way that's not helpful or entail an inadvertent pitfall for actual civil rights advancement. I wonder if you have any thoughts, and maybe as well for attorneys beyond just the DMV area.
Yeah, and I actually live in Washington State, so I can't speak as well specifically to the DMV area, but I can say, first of all, if possible, start before you have that case. Start educating yourself now, so when you have the case that comes along, you're a little bit more prepared. But reach out to different organizations, right? So, Alana mentioned that there's a equivalent of Equality Ohio in almost all the states, right? There's like Equal Rights Washington, Equality Ohio, and I think there's even a website that lists them all. I don't know if, Alana, you could put that in this chat. You can reach out to that organization. The ACLU also has affiliates in almost all of the states, so, and then there's also other LGBT organizations. A lot of states have an LGBT bar association that you can reach out to, and they provide trainings on these. I know that the equivalent organization here in Washington does trainings for lawyers and for judges on LGBTQ issues, and it's specific to the legal practice. If you find yourself kind of grappling with an issue that you think is a little bit sensitive and you're not sure how to navigate it, reach out to one of those organizations and just ask them to kind of talk it through with you, or if they can kind of review the argument. We generally appreciate those kinds of things because we don't want, bad law out there. So having somebody kind of reach out to us is a good thing. And sometimes that's also how we get involved in cases, right? I have a case right now in Illinois that just local counsel was assigned as a public defender a case and realized that there were some kind of, trans issues that were beyond her expertise. She reached out to the ACLU and we are working together on that case now. So I would recommend looking kind of at your local resources, and that I think every state has them.
Great. Thank you, Lee. As I said, I wish that we could turn to every single one of these questions from our audience because they're wonderful, they're thoughtful, they're critical and insightful. But we also have a schedule to maintain and the rest of your evenings to give back to you. So with that in mind, I want to turn to the next segment of this conversation. It's a really wonderful one, in my opinion, because it's called the call to action. We've filled this time with so much information, from lived experiences to learned perspectives and to technical details about how this work gets done. And that is understandably a lot to absorb in a single setting. And so I hope that this call to action that you'll hear from each of us offers you an opportunity to crystallize on these learning experiences through the perspectives of our wonderful panelists. And you'll even get a guest cameo from your classmate, Marion, in a moment here. But first, I want to hear from the panelists for your call to action. And I'll just go around the metaphysical room. And I would love to start with Jorge, if you wouldn't mind, Jorge.
And clearly, we're all doing this work on different fronts from across the nation. And so I will say, my call to action is that we can't do this alone. It takes tremendous effort to continue to triage the urgency of the needs of our LGBTQ youth and our LGBTQ people. And so I would say get involved in whatever organization is closest to you. Now, obviously, I could say, please donate to Smile, and also please donate to Smile, smyal.org/donate. But also, there are a lot of organizations across the nation that are doing this work that are now under scrutiny constantly because of the legislation that's moving forward. So please support them. And then also, I'll add, ask them how you can support them. Sometimes folks will email us and they're like, we'd love to volunteer. And I'm like, okay, then I have to create a volunteering opportunity. So I would say, ask them what would be helpful for us to do. They will tell you exactly this, we need X, Y, and Z. And so reach out to them and get that support. We cannot do this without the generous support of everybody who is on this panel, but also participating and here today to listen to these messages. It's a first step in a ripple of social action that goes across the nation.
Thank you, Jorge. Lee, would you care to enlighten us with your call to action? I know we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So one of the themes that we've heard tonight, unfortunately, is that so many states are trying to erase and eradicate LGBTQ youth. And so we can't let that happen, right? LGBTQ people, and particularly trans youth, are a small minority of the population, and us, with our voices alone, is not going to be enough to kind of beat this back. And so we need allies. And what that can look like is think about how you can be vocal and take action to support LGBTQ youth. Like Jorge said, money goes a really long way, in supporting the efforts to battle these bills on the ground, to support the youth themselves, to finance the litigation. That's not all, right? So the money, you've got time, educate yourselves, follow, LGBTQ folks on social media, learn about them, see what's going on. And they'll also kind of flag a lot of points of action, right? Last week was Trans Week of Action. And so there was a lot of things happening. And, if you're following people on social media, you can see that going on. Speak about these issues at your dinner table with your family, with your friends, talk about it, kind of push back on people that don't agree with you, but also just make it clear that you are that safe space for people. Because like I said, you don't know who's listening. And I think just don't let these issues and these people be erased, right? You shine light on it, lift it up. The ACLU filed this great amicus brief, and it was just really about trans joy. And it's trans adults talking about their success in life and their joy in life, and let's lift that up as well in these really dark times.
again, and unsurprisingly, so well said. I couldn't agree with you more. As I hope to have explicated earlier in our conversation, the very nature of queer liberation and of equality for queer folks is a two-sided coin. And on the one side, there are these unfortunate dark moments, but on the other is the resiliency that Alana spoke to earlier, and an unwillingness to remain in a status quo that subjugates us for our basic humanity. And that pride and that resiliency and that joy is something to celebrate and lift up. And speaking of Alana, I would love to hear from you next.
Absolutely. You mentioned in the very beginning that I'm the board chair of the Equality Federation, and I haven't talked much about them, but I want to hear. The Equality Federation is a federation of all of the organizations like Equality Ohio that exist across the states. Most states have an organization like us. Some actually have two. So my call to action tonight is please get to know your state equality organization. We are the entities that are fighting on the front lines of the State House for policy change. Find your state equality organization. Please join their mailing list for their actions. Listen to them, take their lead in what actions are needed in your state, and then please donate to those organizations. There is a misconception out there that LGBTQ work is somehow extremely well funded. I am telling you, we barely get by. My opposition in our state just got a $5 million influx from individual donations. We have never seen money at that level. So truly, this is something that every donation matters, no matter what its size is. And every call to your legislator, when they give you that action that says, call your legislator, you may be picking up the phone and say, my call doesn't matter. It does. There's a legislative aid there tallying for or against, and we need as many on the side that your state organization is asking for as possible.
Thank you so much, Alana. And to your last point about voicing your opinions, I would just remind folks, Google is your friend when it comes to finding who is elected to represent you in a particular office, whether it's the local, the state, or the national level. And every single one of those people has someone on their payroll whose job it is to have a phone number that you can call to say exactly what Alana just explained. So my call to action was going to be to encourage you all to open up your wallets and your pocketbooks. But our lovely panelists in more ways than one kind of covered that for us. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit to framing sort of issues as I opened this conversation. My call to action and my framing issue has to do with listening, and namely about doing more of it and speaking less. I think that there is a lot of value to be had in just keeping quiet, not saying anything, and just listening and learning. Being quiet is free of charge. It costs us nothing. And yet listening and being quiet is tremendously valuable. And that is especially true when we're engaging with people whose lived experiences differ from our own. That's a tremendous learning experience. And we have so much more to lose when we speak without listening than when we listen without speaking. So I encourage us all, myself included, to do more listening without speaking than we do speaking without listening. And I'm willing to bet that if we do that, and if we donate to these wonderful organizations, we can each play a meaningful part in making tomorrow better than today for queer young people. And with that, I want to turn it back to your wonderful classmate, our gracious host of sorts, Marion. Marion, I believe, also has a call to action to share with us, and I would love to hear it too.
I have a call to action, but first, before I do, I want to thank all of you for this such beautiful, heartfelt, and wonderful information. I just feel overwhelmed and so grateful. My call to action is an invitation because Class Act is a partner of Justice Aid, which was founded by our classmate, Steve Milliken. And Justice Aid is presenting 2 events in New York in May, and I'd like to invite all of you to attend them. And the first is the Justice Aid Spring Forum at the Riverside Church on May 15th, and it's called Erasure, the Otherization of Queerness. And the second is Justice Aid Spring Concert Benefit, Bessie, Empress of the Blues at City Winery in Manhattan. So that's on the 16th of May. So make a trek to New York if you aren't there already, and join us all for those extraordinary events. And all of the money that comes from those goes directly to SMILE. 100% of donations to Justice Aid this year go to SMILE and their extraordinary work. For full information, go to the Justice Aid website. And with that, I want to thank you, Taz, Alana, Jorge, and Lee for sharing so much information and wisdom with us this evening, and for your work every day on all of our behalves, because indeed this work is for all of us. Thanks also go to the program and production teams for this evening: Donna Brorby, Lindsay Strauss, Therese Steiner, Steve Milliken, Jackie Swearingen, Sarah Greenberg, Sarah Ulrich, Kate Fried, Katie Marinello, and Diana Labanchu. And special thanks to our videographer, Rick Brotman, for creating the videos for all of our class act forums. Thank you to Taz and to all of our panelists, and let's keep working on this important issue and helping all of us. Good evening.